soldiers, you are about to embark upon the Great Crusade.
Good evening, soldiers. My name is Private Matthew, and I'll be doing your briefing today. I've grown up across the United States, both on the West Coast and in the South, and I've learned a lot about our American history. But more importantly, I've learned many different versions of American history. I went from growing up learning that this party is the best thing ever, and everything they do is perfect, to actually this side should have won that war, and they were perfectly justified, and it wasn't about what you were thinking about. Please don't read that resolution, dear God. I wanted to look into that. Without jumping immediately into the extremely controversial stuff, I still have a long way to go. I can feel my hair growing gray already just thinking about it. But instead, I wanted to cover something I find a little more interesting. The Articles of Confederation. I remember hearing about it in school. I remember hearing about it in videos where people try to use it as justification for being able to drive wherever the fuck they want. But what did it actually say? Like, what does it mean? What is the Articles of Confederation? And what did it actually do? Oftentimes, I get pretty basic excuses like, oh, it's the Articles of Confederation. What's a good example? It was sloppy. It didn't give Congress enough power. There was no judicial branch. There was no executive branch. That's great and all, but how did the states interact with this government to make those painfully obvious? And that turned out to be a much deeper subject that I'm not going to be able to cover today. But let's go ahead and go over what the Articles of Confederation are, and more importantly, what they say and who wrote it. We're going to be starting right at the beginning of when the Articles of Confederation began to be conceived, and that was with a proposal by Virginian politician Richard Henry Lee. Richard Henry Lee was a prominent politician. He was part of House of Burgess, and actually did have formal education in England. He actually has a pretty colorful story stretching back into the 1750s. For example, he was attempted to join the French and Indian War, but he was told not to. But more importantly, he was elected to the First Continental Congress in 1774. Of course, we all know what the Continental Congress is. It's the 13 colonies coming together, although at this time it was only 12. I'll get into that here when it's relevant. And they were trying to figure out, okay, so benign neglect has ended. We don't like the crown being here. What are we going to do? Which is a very good explanation for all things American history up until the First World War. But let's go ahead and get into what Henry Lee actually proposed. And his proposal was made on June 7th, 1776. This proposal was pretty simple. It established three ideas. The first one being that the colonies were essentially independent and should declare so. We need to get foreign support set up, and we need to draft a proposal of governance for the colonies to consider. It's actually a pretty simple proposal. It's relatively short. This was in response to, namely, attempts to assuage hostilities with the crown being unsuccessful. The most popular of these, and the most oftenly cited, is the Olive Branch proposal, which was sent on July 5th, 1775. It was sent to King George III. Reportedly, he never even read it and just declared them to be rebels. The Georgian monarchy started to establish mercenary groups within the country. And I would like to establish some information about these mercenary groups. They're not mercenaries in the way that you or I think. They're not private military corporations. They are not soldiers of fortune. This actually would be a system closer to what we'd see in a video game like Europa Universalis 4 with the condottieri system. You know, the system where you would offer to rent out your troops for a fee, and they would fight on behalf of the nation that you hired them to. This is exactly what we'd see, actually, with the Hessians. And the principal states, which gives them their names, are the principalities of, let's see here, Hesse-Kassel and Hesse-Hanau. And these two states were built on military service. In the United States history, they're oftentimes called mercenaries. And of course, there is the legendary Christmas Day attack where a bunch of them surrendered to George Washington. This image of them is mostly false. These were not mercenaries. These were crowned and trained soldiers. These were men at arms. They were hired because they were a professional army. They weren't a band. It's important to remember that. The term mercenary is extremely controversial when referring to the Hessian military. And just keep that in mind when you talk about the Hessians. Remember, they are a standing army. They were well trained. These are not your average band of hooligans. This would also add to the idea that the United States was being occupied. You suddenly have a bunch of people. They don't speak English. They speak German. They are saying they're here on behalf of your king, and they're forcing you to do things. It gets very, very awkward. They have a different way of doing things. They have a different disciplinary structure. Even if you were part of the British military, you probably would have an issue with foreign powers being in your country. Again, this was happening right around the same time that the Olive Branch Proposal was sent. The Olive Branch Proposal is interesting because it actually was written at a time when there were only 12 members of the Continental Congress. Reading the document, you can see that one state is left out, Georgia. And the reason why is actually quite simple. Georgia was not politically stable at the time. It was turning into a massive issue to the point where the literal election that occurred in 75 was built around, are you a Whig, who is pro-revolution, anti-British, or are you a Tory, which is pro-British, anti-revolution? Georgia would eventually side with the Whig Party. And the Whig Party, as a matter of fact, had actually already sent a delegation to the Continental Congress. His name was Lyman Hall. And for the life of me, I can't actually tell when he arrived in Philadelphia. I can tell you that he was sent before the election because he received his appointment in Philadelphia. I just can't tell you if he was there for the Olive Branch Proposal. Judging by the fact that the proposal was sent July 5th, 75, and the Continental Congress was officially joined by Georgia in July 4th of the same year, I am willing to bet that Lyman Hall was probably in Philadelphia when this was signed, and I just like to imagine him awkwardly sitting in a corner, wishing he could put his name on that document. Because, geez, if the Whig Party could secure, an agreement with the Crown, and them flat out say, yo, we're not actually, full on this whole independence thing yet, might be really good for them in the future. Of course, that wasn't the case, and it doesn't really matter because King George himself was the one who shut it down. This would lead to the Lee Proposal being drafted 1 year later in 1776 because these hostilities continued, and they spiraled really hard. The Lee Proposal itself had received a unanimous support from the Continental Congress. It passed 12 yes, 0 no, and 1 I can't vote. And the one who couldn't vote, funnily enough, is New York, which, if you know anything about the United States Revolution, is strange because New York was one of the major regional powers. The reason why is actually quite simple. The Lee Proposal included the Declaration of Independence. This was not something on New York's ticket, as in these delegates did not have the power to declare independence. So they had to leave, share it with their Congress, and the Congress of New York itself voted and passed the Lee Proposal on July 9th, 76, flat out saying, I'm in, sign me up. So in reality, it was a 13 yes vote. Everyone was in on this. They determined as they were getting this all set up that the best way to have this all done was to set up committees. There was a committee to draft the Declaration of Independence. There was a committee to draft public support and foreign support because they knew they couldn't do this alone. But most importantly for this video, there was one last committee, 13 members. Their job was to draft what we now call the Articles of Confederation. Oh boy. The Articles of Confederation started off the bat with a very, very interesting man who ended up being in charge of it. The Articles of Confederation was put together by a man, well, principally, this was a group effort, but the man who was most responsible for setting up the Articles of Confederation was John Dickinson. And John Dickinson is a character all of himself. This guy never settled down. He just happened to be living in Delaware when he was appointed to Congress. This guy had an equally long political career in Pennsylvania. And he was a veteran of the 7 Years' War. He actually joined politics because of the 7 Years' War, and he was probably the closest you could get at the time to what we consider to be an anarcho-capitalist. He was vehemently anti-central government at this time, and it's kind of shown in his work to undermine the Articles of Confederation, in my opinion. And interestingly enough, the Articles of Confederation seem to be a major part of character development for Mr. Dickinson, because after he saw what the Articles of Confederation did, he chose to support the Federalist Party of the United States. He supported Washington, he supported a strong central government, and he would eventually join the Democratic Republicans, who were pro-Federation, but they weren't as centralized heavy as the Federalist Party, which they replaced. To give you a contrast, this is not quite the same as Mr. Lee. Richard Henry Lee never supported the federal government. He was always behind the idea of a independent system. He was elected to Congress in 1789 as part of the first Congress of the United States. Well, the first constitutional Congress of the federal United States. I'll get into why I say federal here in a second. And he, till the very end, was anti-Federation. So Dickinson, we see a lot of character development. With Lee, we see him continuing to push for this idea of independence. I wonder if this may have to do with the fact that Dickinson was a New Englander for the majority of his life, and maybe, just maybe, Southerners are a bit different. I can't tell you. That's up to you. But I can hear right now a lot of people cheering that I am absolutely right and that you all are indeed built different. But we're not at that point in history. We'll go to that later. The Articles of Confederation was not a constitution. It was actually something far different. It's almost like a charter for the League of Nations. If you all know what the League of Nations is, yeah, you all know what the League of Nations is. You're watching this video. It basically said, we are 13 independent sovereign states, but we agree to put our decisions through a central government. It was not a federation, not even close. It was actually based quite heavily off of Native American confederations. If you all have heard of the Iroquois have a federation, and they were heavily influential on the development of the United States Confederation. The Confederation was an interesting read. I went through it, and I have extracted the system of government and all of the stipulations. Important thing to remember about the Articles of Confederation: it is not like the U.S. Constitution. There is no extrapolation. If it is not in the Articles, it is not allowed. And we'll get into that here in a second. But let's go ahead and go over what this Congress was. Then that would be a seat in a unicameral Congress, and that is it. You have your delegation in the Congress that votes on things. That is all the central government was, and that was all it was ever intended to be under these articles. Now let's go into what this Congress wrote down it was allowed to do. First, the Confederation was to be referred to as the United States of America. Pretty simple, establishes your name as a unit. All states have total sovereignty over matters not covered by the Articles. An attack on one state is an attack on all states in the Confederacy. There would be freedom of movement throughout the Confederacy. There would be freedom of free trade throughout the Confederacy. All states would share a universal extradition treaty in the case of crime. A one-year term in the Continental Congress starting every November 1st. However, the delegation can be changed at will by the state that appointed them. No delegation can be less than 2 or greater than 7 members. All delegates have a 3-year term limit. All delegates are barred from holding a salaried Confederate office. States have to pay for their own delegates. There's no per diem. You have to pay for it. There's 1 vote per state. Freedom of speech and debate for all members of Congress and protection from arrest for congressional speech. If you speak out in Congress, that is your right. And if you exit Congress, they can't arrest you for what's said in Congress, outside of them accusing you of treason, committing a felony, or breaching the peace. States do not have the right to independent treaties or are independent foreign relations with other states and nations without congressional approval. No state nor congressional representative are permitted to accept gifts or titles. No state nor the Congress has the authority to establish royal titles. States are not to enact taxes or import duties that contradict with congressional agreements with foreign nations. The maximum number of warships held by individual states was to be dictated by Congress. All states are to keep an amply stocked with surplus on their own dime, militia to be called upon by the United States in times of war and unrest. No state may initiate war without the consent of Congress unless they are attacked or reasonable evidence of plans to make war by native nations. No commission of warships, letters of marque, or reprisal can be made until after the Congress of the United States declares war, and only to the Crown and subjects thereof, being the belligerents of the war, may these be issued. Essentially, you can't go after someone you're not at war with. The only exception to this rule is if a state is so pirate-infested, Congress authorizes use of warships, and these warships will be decommissioned once the discontinuation of congressional approval is submitted. When army forces are raised, all offices colonel and under are for the states to appoint and refill in the arisal of vacancies. When war is initiated, all expenses incurred in the communal defense of the United States and other approved expenses by Congress will be paid for by a common treasury supplied by all states. The contributions are determined by the value of the land each state entails, by measurement of a congressional survey. These surveys are hired and dispatched by Congress, and payment terms and timelines are also determined by Congress. The states are responsible for taxes and methods used to raise the prescribed amounts. If this sounds like the IRS, yeah. An assembled Congress alone can send and receive dignitaries. States have all rights to interest rate matters and methods of courts they wish to use. However, no member of Congress may receive an appointment. When disputes between states cannot find resolution, Congress shall act as a court while these assembled to settle disputes. Territory disputes are congressional jurisdiction. Only Congress can set the type of ally and denominations used in currency. Only Congress can determine relations with natives. Only Congress can define weights and measures used within the nation. Congress alone can appoint non-regimental officers. All Navy officers are by congressional appointment. All commissions and ROEs determined by Congress. Congress may establish post offices independently of states as long as it doesn't interfere with the state system. We'll get to that. Extra congressional committees of 13 members, one per state, may be established to work on general, less important issues while full Congress is in recess. If you know anything about modern Congress, we have this today. It is pretty standard. There is a member of the Congress selected every year to act as an accountant. The main responsibility of this accountant is to determine expected budgetary requirements and to raise bonds as needed. The actions of the accountant are subject to a semi-annual review by individual states to discourage misuse of funds. This member of Congress is also responsible for collecting income from the states and funding supplies for the Navy and determining the expected levy from each state. Levies are specifically determined by the white male population of the state. To put this simply, Congress passes a tax. It is up to that selected accountant to make sure those taxes are paid. If a state over-recruits, Congress may or may not agree to fund the training and livery of the extra men. Congress may also choose to arbitrarily lower or exempt levies expected of states if the state cannot raise the allotted number. So essentially, Congress does have the ability to say, okay, all right, you're having a hard time. We're gonna take this off your back. Congress needs a minimum of 9 votes to do the following: declare war, grant letters of reprisal, grant letters of marque, enter any treaty or alliance, coin money, regulate money's value, or ascertain sums and expenses for welfare or warfare, emit bills, borrow money on behalf of the United States, appropriate money, agree to build or purchase warships, numbers of land and sea forces to raise, or appoint commander-in-chief of army or naval forces. If you've heard all of that, you may have noticed this is a relatively large proportion of the powers even given to this Congress. And remember, it's not listed, they can't do it. So in order for the nation to even defend itself, you need a 9/13 vote, which is actually really hard to get. To put this into context, this is like getting 69 of the 100 senators in Congress to vote on one issue. Considering that most bills pass with like a 55 or 52 vote margin, I'm assuming you can see the problem. This also isn't the end of the Articles of Confederation. This is just when they decided to tell us what powers need a 9-vote minimum. So let's go ahead and continue this list here. Congress may adjourn at any time during the year. It may also relocate wherever and whenever it wishes, as long as the process does not take up more than 6 months of the year. There will be a monthly published update on work in progress within Congress. The only exception is foreign treaties and matters of military interest that require secrecy to maintain safety. State legislatures may request further information on items within the update and receive transcripts relevant to the issues requested. Note this is a right not extended to the average citizen. This is state legislature only. When Congress is in recess, states or 9 of said states may come together to invoke limited powers of the assembled Congress as a committee of states. There is a specific stipulation allowing Canada to join the Union. Any other colony that wanted to join needs to receive a 9 vote. All debts incurred by members of the United States before its creation are still liable to repay those debts. All states are bound to these articles. Membership is perpetual and immutable. Amendment of the articles requires a unanimous vote. We'll get to that one for sure. For amendments to be ratified, all members, state legislators must ratify. These four may be similar. A lot of these points are also in the Constitution. The final article of this is a commemoration to the god and an affirmation that all members present agree and abide by the articles. Yeah. The Articles of Confederation is interesting. It is simultaneously far more in-depth and also way looser than I was expecting. The first thing you may notice is that these are somewhat vague, which, when you declare as binding to the letter, may be a cause for confusion. A good example that I immediately noticed is the post offices. The post service is mentioned only once, and it's in a way to imply that the national and state services are separate. And how would you enforce? Can states refuse interstate offices by arguing they have agreements with the next state over mail import? Could they claim the USPS interferes with their system? Does Congress pay for these? The budget doesn't seem to include a stipulation allowing for post services to be supplied and paid for by the central government. Would this be you build it for the state and they have to agree to pay for it? I can't tell with the articles because it just doesn't explain. And if you wanted to get this fixed, how would you pass an amendment? All you need is for one state to refuse. Say this is over a state in Maryland, or this is an affair in Maryland where Congress wants to build a post office. Maryland doesn't want the post office. Everyone can vote yes, except for Maryland. And the issue's dead. It's done. Maryland said no. It's just so easy to get these amendments shot down. And to give you an idea, the current system requires a 3/4 ratification by all states in the United States. There have been 11,000 amendments that have been proposed according to official congressional archives, and only 27 have ever been ratified. And the current system requires a 2/3 vote in both houses and 3/4 approving vote by all states. A 27 out of 11,000, and it's a 3/4 vote. Again, it is impossible to get the majority or a super majority like this to agree. The Congress also really can't enforce its tax income if one state decides it can or won't pay. There's really not much they can do. The articles don't say that Congress can declare war on non-paying members, but this might just be my personal beliefs filtering in, but in order for people to listen to you, you kind of need to have the mechanism to enforce your will on the refusal. Otherwise, your demand sort of lacks force. And this reminds me of a quote by General Clausewitz in On War. War is thus an act of force to compel our enemy to do our will. And the point is, if Congress can't go to war, how can they compel? Imagine you own a house and there's a homeowners association. But the homeowners association isn't organized. They could, if they wanted to, fine you $10 million for parking your car out on the street. But they're not legal. They can't force you to pay. All they can do is annoy you. I mean, if they can't do anything to stop you from not paying, why would you pay? Like, there's a serious loophole here of, I don't wanna. I wish I could say that and not have to do things. And there you have it. That's our first general overview of the Articles of Confederation and what came before the Constitution. This is mainly just an overlook of what this document was and reading of it, a bit more analytical. I still have a lot of questions I intend to answer, and I really just view this video as a good starting point. So if you have any further questions, please add them to the comments. I'd love to know what your questions are. A huge benefit to putting my ideas out here on the internet is that I get to hear other people's ideas. And sometimes you just need a fresh pair of eyes. So if you have any questions or concerns, go ahead and comment, like, and subscribe if you want to. I've been your briefer, Private Matt, and I'll see you all around the bend.